Silence before the character. Beijing, 1750. Brother Etienne Rouault had been in the service of the Qing court for barely a year when Father Amiot first showed him the manuscript that would occupy, in one form or another, the remainder of both their lives. A slim, unremarkable-looking volume of Chinese characters that the elder Jesuit had acquired, with some difficulty and no small expense, from a retired military official willing to part with his family's copy for reasons Etienne would only later come to understand had rather more to do with the political dangers of owning it than with any indifference to its value. This, Father Amiot told him, in the quiet study the two Jesuits shared within the walls of the mission compound in Beijing, is a text that has shaped Chinese statecraft and Chinese warfare for well over 2,000 years, studied by every serious commander, and I have come increasingly to suspect, by every serious minister of state as well, though the mandarins who study it for the latter purpose are considerably more reluctant to admit as much to a foreign missionary than the generals are. It is called, in the tradition that has grown up around it, simply the Sunzi, the Master Sun's writings on war, and I have become convinced, over these past several years of studying it, with what limited native assistance I have been able to quietly arrange, that it contains ideas of a subtlety and a universality that Europe has simply never encountered in its own considerable body of military and strategic writing, and that it would be an act of genuine scholarly negligence to leave it forever untranslated, known only within the narrow circle of a single civilization's own military tradition. Etienne, then a young man not yet 30, newly arrived in a court whose intricate political and cultural machinery he was still struggling to understand in even its most basic outline, could not yet fully appreciate what Father Amiot was proposing, a translation project that would eventually take the better part of 2 decades, conducted almost entirely in secret, under conditions of political risk that neither man fully understood at the outset, and that would ultimately require Etienne himself to master a body of strategic thinking he had originally approached as a mere linguistic curiosity, but that would, by the end, come to shape his own conduct at a court he had not yet learned to navigate at all. What the text actually said. The early years of the translation work, conducted in the careful, patient manner such projects necessarily required, a page here, a passage there, whenever the two Jesuits could secure a few uninterrupted hours away from the considerable demands of their official duties at court, which required both men to serve, among their other responsibilities, as astronomers, cartographers, and occasional advisors on European mechanical and artistic techniques, the Qianlong Emperor's court found genuinely useful. Introduced Etienne gradually to a body of thought considerably more sophisticated than the simple military manual he had initially expected. You will notice, Father Amiot told him, during one of their early sessions working through the text's opening passages, that this work does not begin as one might expect a European military treatise to begin, with a discussion of formations, weapons, or tactics in any narrow sense. It begins instead with an insistence that war itself is a matter of the very greatest gravity to any state, a matter of life and death, of survival and ruin, that must be examined with the most careful and disciplined thought before any campaign is ever undertaken at all, and that the truly skilled commander, the text insists again and again, seeks victory through methods that minimize actual fighting altogether, since a victory achieved through direct battle, however successful, is by this text's own explicit reckoning an inferior achievement compared to a victory achieved by breaking an enemy's will or capacity to resist before battle is ever joined. Etienne found himself, over the following months of careful, line-by-line translation work, increasingly struck by how thoroughly the text's central preoccupations diverged from the European military writing he had studied in his own earlier education, a divergence that Father Amyot, with the particular relish of a scholar who has found genuinely new intellectual territory late in a long career, delighted in pointing out at every opportunity. European military writing, by and large, concerns itself with the mechanics of battle, once battle has already been decided upon, formations, siege techniques, the proper deployment of cavalry and infantry, Father Amyot observed. This text concerns itself, first and above all else, with the question of whether battle should be fought at all, and under what conditions, and through what preparations of intelligence, deception, and careful calculation a wise commander might avoid the enormous cost of battle entirely, achieving through cunning and patience what a less skilled commander might otherwise attempt at far greater cost, through direct force of arms. I do not believe I exaggerate, Brother Etienne, when I tell you that I have found nothing in the whole of European strategic writing that approaches this text's sophistication on precisely this point. The idea that the highest form of military skill lies not in winning battles, but in avoiding the need to fight them at all. The court that watched everything. It was in the same period that Etienne began, almost without conscious intention at first, to notice parallels between the strategic principles he was helping translate and the considerably more subtle, considerably less bloody conflicts playing out constantly around him within the elaborate political machinery of the imperial court itself. A court in which the Jesuit missionaries occupied a position of genuine but always precarious value, tolerated and even favored for their demonstrated usefulness in astronomy, cartography, mechanical arts, and occasional diplomatic utility, but never entirely secure from the shifting currents of court factionalism, imperial mood, and the deep, persistent suspicion that a great many senior mandarins continue to harbor toward foreign advisors granted access to the emperor's own person. You must understand, Father Amyot told him, during a period when a particular faction at court, resentful of the missionaries' continued favor, had begun quietly circulating accusations questioning the Jesuits' true loyalties and intentions, that our own survival and continued usefulness here depends on exactly the kind of careful, patient, strategic thinking this text describes. We cannot defeat our rivals at court through any direct confrontation. We possess no formal standing to challenge accusations made through proper Mandarin channels, no political faction of our own to call upon for support, no recourse beyond the Emperor's own continued personal favor, which must be carefully, patiently maintained rather than ever taken for granted. Our entire position here rests on making ourselves valuable enough, indispensable enough, and unthreatening enough that the Emperor himself continues to see more advantage in protecting us than in yielding to the periodic pressure of court factions who would prefer to see foreign missionaries removed from any position of influence entirely. It was this observation, more than any abstract appreciation of the text's literary or philosophical qualities, that gradually transformed Etienne's relationship to the translation project from a purely scholarly exercise into something considerably more personally urgent. A growing recognition that the strategic principles he was helping render into French might offer genuine practical guidance for navigating the very real, very immediate political dangers that surrounded the Jesuit mission's continued existence at court. A lesson in patience. The first genuine test of this recognition came in the autumn of Etienne's third year at court, when a senior Mandarin official, a man named Wang whose hostility toward the Jesuit mission had been quietly building for some years, finally moved against the missionaries directly, presenting the Emperor with a carefully constructed memorial alleging that the Jesuits' continued presence at court represented a genuine security risk, citing rumors, some genuinely fabricated, others distorted from small, innocent misunderstandings that had been deliberately exaggerated, suggesting the missionaries maintained secret correspondence with European powers hostile to Qing interests. My instinct, Etienne admitted to Father Amyot, in the tense days immediately following the memorial's presentation, is to seek an immediate audience with the Emperor to defend ourselves directly and forcefully against these accusations before they can take deeper root. And that, Father Amyot replied, with the calm, deliberate patience that Etienne had by then come to recognize as the elder Jesuit's most valuable diplomatic quality, is precisely the instinct our text would counsel us against indulging, at least in the manner you are currently imagining. Consider what the Sunzi tells us about attacking an enemy's position directly, when that position is well prepared and the enemy fully alert to the threat. Official Wang has spent considerable time and effort constructing this memorial. He is prepared for exactly the kind of direct, urgent defense you are proposing, and has very likely anticipated it, perhaps even prepared his own further arguments specifically to counter whatever defense we might offer in the heat of the moment. A hasty, direct response, however factually justified, plays precisely into the confrontation he has already prepared for. What I propose instead is patience and indirection. We will not seek an audience to defend ourselves at all, ought directly. We will instead, over the following weeks, quietly and without any appearance of urgency, make ourselves more visibly useful to the Emperor than we have been in some months. Father Rixai's calendar reforms are due for their annual review, and I happen to know the Emperor has expressed private curiosity about certain new European instruments recently arrived through the Canton trade. We will attend to these matters with particular care and visible diligence, reminding the Emperor, through action rather than through any direct defense, of exactly the value our continued presence provides him. And we will trust that a memorial built largely on vague suspicion and distorted rumor will, given enough time and given a sufficiently vivid reminder of our genuine usefulness, simply fail to gain the traction its author hopes for, without our ever needing to dignify its specific accusations with the kind of direct, defensive response that would only draw further attention to them. The strategy worked over the following 2 months, precisely as Father Amyot had predicted, the Emperor's attention gently and patiently redirected toward the Jesuits' genuine and visible usefulness, gradually cooled toward official Wang's memorial, which was eventually allowed to lapse without formal action, its accusations never directly rebutted, but simply, through the passage of time and the accumulation of contrary evidence of the missionaries' continued value, rendered increasingly irrelevant. The deeper lesson. I want you to understand something about what we have just done, Father Amyot told Etienne once the immediate danger had clearly passed, because I think it illustrates, better than any passage of direct translation could on its own, the deepest principle this text actually teaches, beneath all its more famous specific maxims about deception and calculation. We did not defeat official Wang. We did not need to. We simply made his attack irrelevant by demonstrating, through action rather than argument, that the premise underlying his entire memorial, that the Jesuit mission's value to the Emperor was questionable enough to weigh seriously against vague and unproven suspicions, was simply false. And we did this without ever engaging him in the kind of direct confrontation that would have required either of us to risk a decisive and possibly unfavorable judgment from the Emperor on the narrow question of whether the specific accusations were true or false. This is, I have come to believe, the truest and most difficult lesson of this entire text, and the one most poorly served by translations and summaries that focus only on its more memorable specific maxims about knowing one's enemy or exploiting terrain. The highest strategic skill this text describes is not cleverness in battle, not even cleverness in avoiding battle through deception, though both of those things matter considerably. It is the deeper, more patient discipline of arranging one's entire position, political, military, or otherwise, so thoroughly and so favorably in advance that the crisis, when it eventually comes, finds you already positioned to weather it without ever needing to fight the battle your enemy has prepared for you to fight. What the Emperor himself understood. It was several years further into the translation project, by which point Etienne's own understanding of both the text and the court had matured considerably, that the two Jesuits found themselves granted a rare and genuinely remarkable opportunity, a private audience with the Qianlong Emperor himself, arranged not through any Jesuit initiative, but at the Emperor's own request, prompted by his having learned, through channels neither missionary ever fully traced, that the foreign priests had been quietly engaged for some years in translating one of the great classical texts of Chinese strategic thought into their own European language. He wished to know, Father Amyot recounted afterward, still visibly moved by the encounter, why two foreign priests, ostensibly occupied with matters of astronomy and religion, had devoted so many years of careful, unpaid labor to a text concerned with warfare, a subject that might seem, on its surface, to have little natural connection to our own stated purposes at his court. I told him what I genuinely believe, which is that this text seemed to me to contain wisdom of a kind that transcended any single civilization's particular military traditions, wisdom that I believed my own countrymen, whatever their considerable accomplishments in other areas of strategic and philosophical thought, had simply never articulated with the same clarity or the same systematic completeness, and that I considered it a genuine service to European learning to make this wisdom more widely available. The Emperor's response, as Father Amyot related it, struck both Jesuits as a rare and genuinely illuminating glimpse into how thoroughly the text's principle had been absorbed over 2,000 years into the deepest assumptions of Chinese statecraft itself, well beyond any narrow military application. He told me, Father Amyot recounted, that he did not consider this text to be primarily about warfare at all, in the narrow sense your own countrymen might assume from its title and its most famous passages. He told me he considered it, at its deepest level, a text about the proper exercise of judgment under conditions of uncertainty and risk, a discipline applicable, in his own experience of governing an empire of many hundreds of millions of subjects across territories more vast and more varied than any single European kingdom, to matters of taxation, of agricultural policy, of the careful management of factional rivalry among his own ministers, every bit as much as to the conduct of actual military campaigns. He told me, in fact, that he considered a minister who had genuinely absorbed this text's deeper principles, but had never commanded a single soldier in his life, to be in most practical respects a better strategist than a general who had fought 100 battles, but never truly grasped the text's underlying logic of patient calculation and the careful management of an opponent's expectations. The danger of the work itself. It was not, however, a project entirely free of genuine political risk, and it was in the later years of the translation's completion that Etienne came to understand more fully the particular dangers his elder colleague had, in his own quiet and characteristically understated way, been managing throughout the entire 2 decades of their collaboration. There are those at court, Father Amyot confided to him, In the final year before the completed manuscript was finally ready to be sent, through the careful and circuitous channels of the Jesuit mission's ongoing correspondence with Europe, to colleagues in Paris who had expressed interest in publishing it, who would regard the transmission of this particular text to European hands with considerably greater alarm than they have ever regarded our more ordinary scholarly and diplomatic activities. A text containing the accumulated strategic wisdom of 2,000 years of Chinese statecraft and warfare, translated and made available to the very European powers whose own commercial and, in some cases, territorial ambitions in this part of the world have grown considerably more assertive over the years of our own residence here, could reasonably be regarded by anyone inclined to view our presence with suspicion as an act bordering on genuine betrayal of the trust and hospitality this court has extended to us across so many years. I do not believe myself that this fear is entirely justified. I have always regarded genuine scholarly translation as a service to universal human understanding rather than an act of any particular political consequence, and I do not believe this single text, however remarkable, will meaningfully alter the balance of power between European and Chinese interests in any direct or immediate sense. But I have been careful throughout these 2 decades of work to conduct this project with a discretion that I would not have thought necessary for a purely scholarly translation of, say, a work of Chinese poetry or philosophy, precisely because I understand that not everyone at this court would share my own more generous assessment of its ultimate consequences, and I have preferred, on balance, to complete this work quietly and send it onward without ever forcing the question of whether it required formal permission that might, given the political currents of recent years, quite plausibly have been refused. The manuscript's journey. The completed translation, finished in the early months of 1772, after more than 2 decades of patient, intermittent labor, was eventually sent to Europe through the ordinary channels of Jesuit missionary correspondence, bundled among other scholarly materials, religious correspondence, and the various astronomical and cartographic reports that formed the Jesuit mission's regular and expected communication with colleagues and superiors in France. A method of transmission that Father Amyot had, by this point in his long career at court, refined into a considerable art of its own. The safest way to move something of genuine importance across a great distance and through many hands, he explained to Etienne as they prepared the final packet of materials for its long journey, is very often not to conceal it especially carefully, which tends only to draw suspicion to precisely the item one is most anxious to protect, but rather to embed it within a larger, entirely ordinary body of correspondence and material that no single reader along its journey has any particular reason to examine with special care. Our translation will travel to Paris not as a solitary, precious document requiring extraordinary protection, but as one modest ite. Among dozens of others, astronomical observations, botanical notes, routine mission correspondence, carried by the same regular channels that have safely conveyed our ordinary reports to Europe for decades, precisely because those channels have, by this point, become boring enough, in the very best sense of that word, that no one along the route has any particular incentive to examine their contents with unusual scrutiny. The manuscript reached Paris later that same year and was published, to modest but genuine scholarly interest, as part of a larger multi-volume work on Chinese military and cultural affairs. The first time, so far as either Jesuit or their eventual French editors were able to determine, that Sun Tzu's ancient treatise had ever been rendered into any European language at all, opening, for the small circle of European readers who encountered it over the following decades, an entirely new body of strategic thought that had, until that moment, existed in complete isolation from the whole of European military and philosophical tradition. What became of the translation? Etienne, by this point himself an aging man who had spent the greater part of his own adult life in the Qing court service, remained in Beijing for the rest of his working career, and it was only through the occasional, slow correspondence with European colleagues that he learned, over the following years and decades, something of how the translation had eventually been received and, in certain circles, put to practical use. "I am told," he wrote, in one of his own later letters to a former student who had since returned to France, that our translation has found its way into the hands of a number of French military officers and theorists in the years since its publication, and that certain of them have found in it considerably more genuine strategic insight than I suspect either Father Amyot or I entirely anticipated when we began this work so many years ago, imagining it, at least at the outset, as primarily a matter of scholarly and philosophical interest, rather than any genuinely practical military value to a European audience, already possessed of its own long and considerable tradition of strategic writing. There is a rumor, and I state it only as rumor, since I have no direct means of verifying it from this distance, that a certain young artillery officer, whose name I am told is beginning to be spoken of with some considerable interest in French military circles, has read our translation with particular attention and has been heard to speak approvingly of certain of its central principles regarding the avoidance of unnecessary battle and the careful, patient calculation of an enemy's true weaknesses before any engagement is undertaken. I do not know whether this rumor is accurate, or whether, if accurate, this particular officer's career will ultimately amount to anything of lasting historical significance. But I confess, I find a certain quiet satisfaction in the thought that a text I spent so many patient years helping to render into French, working alongside a colleague whose own careful, patient application of that very text's principles helped preserve our modest mission's place at this court across so many years of genuine political danger, might yet go on to shape the strategic thinking of a new generation of European commanders, in ways that neither Father Amyot nor I, laboring quietly over these pages so many years ago in a Beijing study, could ever have fully anticipated. The final years. Father Amyot lived to see the translation's publication and its early, gradually growing reputation among European readers, though he did not live to learn with any certainty whether the specific rumor Etienne had passed along in his letters concerning the young artillery officer's interest in the text carried any genuine historical significance. Dying in Beijing some years before that officer's name would become known across the whole of Europe as one of the most consequential military commanders of his entire age. I have often wondered, Etienne wrote in one of his final letters, composed not long before his own death, many years after his elder colleague's passing, whether Father Amyot would have found it a source of particular pride or, in his characteristically modest way, merely a matter of passing scholarly interest, to learn that the text he spent 2 decades helping to translate may have shaped, in some genuine, if impossible to precisely measure way, the strategic thinking of one of the most significant military figures our own century has yet produced. I suspect, knowing him as I did across so many years of shared labor and shared political peril at this remarkable court, that he would have regarded any such influence as considerably less important in the final accounting than the simple fact of the text's survival and transmission itself. The fact that an idea 2,000 years old nearly lost within the narrow confines of a single civilization's own military tradition, had been carried through the patient, careful, and often genuinely dangerous labor of 2 foreign priests working quietly in a Beijing study across the entire breadth of the known world to take root in soil that had never before had occasion to encounter it at all. I have spent the greater part of my own long life in this court, navigating, as best I have been able, the same patient, careful, strategic discipline that this text first taught me so many years ago, and that Father Amyot demonstrated in practice more consistently and more skillfully than I believe I myself ever fully matched across all my own years of trying. I do not know what will ultimately become of the mission we have served here for so long, or of the broader relationship between our own distant homeland and this vast and remarkable empire that has been, for the whole of my adult life, the only home I have genuinely known. But I have come to believe, in these final years of my own long service, that the text we spent 2 decades translating contains a wisdom considerably larger than any single application to warfare, or even to the particular political survival of one small mission of foreign priests at one particular court. A wisdom, ultimately, about the patient, careful, and fundamentally humble discipline of understanding one's true position in the world, one's true strengths and true limitations, and the true nature of whatever forces one must eventually contend with, before ever committing to the kind of direct, costly confrontation that a less patient or less careful mind might otherwise rush toward. I believe this to be true whether the forces in question are opposing armies, rival ministers at an imperial court, or simply the ordinary, unglamorous uncertainties of a single human life, lived, as mine has been, very far indeed from the land of one's birth. Epilogue, the study, 2 centuries later. There is a final scene to this account, reconstructed not from any surviving letter of Etienne Roirault's own hand, but from the research of a modern historian, a specialist in the history of Jesuit missions to Qing China, whose own careful work in French and Chinese archives over the course of a long academic career eventually assembled, from scattered fragments of surviving correspondence, official mission records, and the eventual published translation itself, the fullest modern account of exactly how Sun Tzu's ancient text had first made its journey into European hands. What strikes me most, working through this material after so many years of research, the historian wrote in the introduction to her own eventual scholarly account of the translation's history, is how thoroughly the 2 Jesuits' own recorded conduct at court, the patient, indirect, carefully calculated strategies Father Amyot in particular is documented in surviving mission correspondence, to have employed again and again across 2 decades of genuine political peril, appears to embody precisely the principles the text they were translating so painstakingly describes. I do not think this is coincidence. I believe, based on the pattern of surviving evidence, that these 2 men did not merely translate this ancient text as a matter of detached scholarly interest. They lived by it, quite deliberately and quite consciously, in a genuinely foreign and genuinely dangerous political environment where the stakes of miscalculation were, for the entire duration of their mission's existence, considerably higher than most modern readers encountering their story for the first time are likely to fully appreciate. It has become something of a commonplace observation in the centuries since this translation first introduced Sun Tzu's writing to European readers, that the text's principles have found application far beyond the narrow military context of its original composition, in business strategy, in diplomacy, in an enormous range of contexts its ancient author could scarcely have imagined. I would suggest, based on everything the surviving historical record allows us to reconstruct of Etienne Roirault and Jean-Joseph Marie Amyot's own remarkable 2 decades of quiet labor and quiet peril at the Qing court, that this broader applicability was demonstrated, in a sense, before the translation itself was even completed, by the very 2 men who first carried the text, sentence by careful sentence, out of one civilization's guarded tradition and into the wider world, using, all the while, the very principles they were translating to preserve their own precarious place in a court that might, at any number of moments across 2 decades of genuine political danger, have chosen to end their mission entirely. A note on what actually happened. Father Jean-Joseph Marie Amyot was a real French Jesuit missionary who spent the greater part of his adult life, from 1750 until his death in 1793, in the service of the Qing Imperial Court in Beijing, where he became a genuinely significant figure in the broader history of cultural and intellectual exchange between China and Europe, producing extensive scholarly work on Chinese music, history, language, and military thought. In 1772, Amyot published in Paris the first known translation of Sun Tzu's Art of War into any European language, as part of a larger multi-volume compilation on Chinese military affairs. This translation is popularly, though not conclusively, associated with a persistent historical legend, suggesting that Napoleon Bonaparte read and was influenced by Sun Tzu's principles, a claim that historians continue to debate without firm documentary resolution, though the timing, Amyot's translation appearing in Paris, while Napoleon was a young artillery officer coming of age in French military circles, has long fueled the association in popular historical memory. The specific details of Amyot's working relationship with a younger colleague, his methods of political navigation at the Qing court, and his precise means of transmitting the completed manuscript to Europe are dramatized for this account. But the broader historical fact of Amyot's genuinely remarkable, decades-long career as a Jesuit scholar-diplomat at one of the most sophisticated courts in the 18th century world, and his role in introducing Sun Tzu's ancient strategic writing to European readers for the first time in history, is real and well documented in the surviving records of the Jesuit China mission.